When the sun lowers toward the horizon and the sky turns black, when lines blur and things are not exactly what they seem, when the normal makes way for the strange and unexplained, it's time to question what is natural and what lies beyond our understanding. It's time to enter the edge of the unknown with your host, Mark Henry.
My guest on this episode of The Edge of the Unknown is one of the foremost authorities on UFOs and alien interaction, an independent researcher, but also a collaborator with the Mutual UFO Network, MUFON. She is an author, lecturer, and practitioner of hypnosis, a couple of different forms that we'll get into tonight in our discussions. She became intrigued in this field of UFOs when her aunt and uncle, Betty and Barney Hill, were abducted in New Hampshire back in 1961. You've seen her in countless television shows, documentaries. You've heard her voice on tons of podcasts. You've heard her all over the radio. And of course, you've seen her name on the bookshelves of Amazon, booksellers everywhere, and probably your local public library. Her books include Capture, The Betty and Barney Hill UFO Experience, Science Was Wrong, and Fact, Fiction, and Flying Saucers with nuclear physicist and scientific ufologist Stanton Friedman, who is also a friend of the show. Rest in peace, Stanton. He passed away in 2019. And she is also the author of The Alien Abduction Files with Denise Stoner. Her fifth book is called Extraterrestrial Contact: What to Do When You've Been Abducted. And we are going to be delving in that tonight here on The Edge of the Unknown. This is her third appearance on The Edge, and it is my pleasure to welcome back Kathleen Marden. Kathleen, thank you so much for being on.
It's great to be on again. Thanks.
So first and foremost, as we were kind of talking about in waiting in the wings, as I always call it, I know you just posted a great article on your website, which is, for everybody out there who's playing at home, Kathleen-Marden.com, Marden.com, about this whole COVID-19 pandemic. How have you been feeling with all of this social distancing and lack of being able to lecture and go out there and talk with people and do the things that you normally do?
Well, I find it difficult. I am accustomed to traveling about once a month to speak at a conference somewhere and to sell my books and to interact with the public. And I really miss it. But I realize that we have to do this. And the more we can social distance, the faster we will get through this. And it hopefully will be gone. And then we can go on with our lives. But, I think that everybody just grows a little tired of being inside the house, not being able to go out and socialize. But I'll tell you, I live in Florida, and we have had a huge spike in cases.
Mm-hmm.
Our businesses have opened, and even with distancing in the businesses, people are refusing to wear masks. People are coming too close, and there is a huge surge in cases in Florida, and about half of them are under the age of 35.
Mm-hmm. And not to belabor the point, my mother lives in Venice, which is not too far away from you, but obviously on the Gulf Coast. And Sunday, she decided to take a drive down to the beach and said by 8:30 or 9 in the morning, the beaches were already packed. And I thought it was supposed to be social distancing, but I think that all went out the window because of the warmer weather and people just losing their minds and wanting to get outside.
I think so.
Up here in New York, it's a little bit different. We're still, doing the whole instant cart thing, and my wife and I try to stick around and just, do the parks or take, our daughter for walks around the neighborhood and stay out of the stores. But I got to be honest with you, here in the Western New York area, I've seen most people wearing masks and actually following the rules. So I think that's why we've seen everything go on a decline. But hey, nobody's perfect, and we'll figure this out together if we're just, as I always say, being excellent to each other. So
Yes.
anyway, let's move on with the show. And I again appreciate you so much for coming on. This is our third discussion that we've had, and we've got a lot of topics to cover. But I really want to point out to anybody who is not familiar with the case of your aunt and uncle, Betty and Barney Hill, probably the first, if not, it actually has to be the first, really publicized and reported alien abduction that happened back in 1961 in the White Mountains of New Hampshire. Can you give the listeners just an overview of what happened to your aunt and uncle that night? And we'll get into the details as we move along.
Sure. I want to say first that it is the first scientifically investigated case of alien abduction, and there was a lot of evidence in this case. I was 13 years old. Betty and Barney had taken a brief vacation to Niagara Falls. I'd been there the month before and had photographs that I shared with the family. And Barney asked Betty if she had been, and she hadn't. And so he decided to surprise her with a trip to Niagara Falls. And they went on to Toronto and then to Montreal. They intended to spend the night there, but they heard somewhere that a hurricane was coming up the coast. They didn't want to just spend the night there and risk not arriving home before the hurricane struck. So they decided that they would drive down to their home on the seacoast of New Hampshire. It wasn't that long a drive, maybe 5 hours, I think, 4 or 5 hours from Montreal. And so they decided to proceed home, and if they grew tired, they would just stop along the way and spend the night. So they're driving through northern New Hampshire, and Betty sees a new light in the sky. And she doesn't know if UFOs are real, but my family is interested in the space program. We go out to look for satellites at night. Betty has never seen one, but my brother and I have with my grandfather. And who I grew up across the street from my grandparents. I was a lucky kid. And so Betty started to watch this thing to see how it moved. And it was moving erratically. It did not move like a conventional aircraft. And it was coming in closer and closer. And it just drew her attention to it. And she and Barney stopped and they looked at it. And then they got back into the car and they entered a part of northern New Hampshire, kind of just north of central, actually, called Franconia Notch. And this is a really beautiful area. We have the Cannon Mountain Tramway, aerial tramway, and we have the Old Man of the Mountain, which actually fell off the mountain in 2003, but there's a memorial to it now. And so they stopped the car again by the Old Man of the Mountain. And the craft had come in close enough so that they could see it next to the old man's profile. And the old man's profile was 48 feet from chin to forehead. It was like a rock formation that looked like an old man's profile. And they noticed that the craft was at least 1.5 times that length. It was huge. And it appeared to be rotating. And they thought this was highly unusual. They got back into the car and continued to drive south. Barney didn't want to fool around looking at crafts in the sky. He wanted to head home to Portsmouth. He knew that UFOs couldn't be real anyway. So why would he want to look? So they're driving through Lincoln, New Hampshire now, North Lincoln. They've just entered the tourist section. And there are a few cabins and motels and a place called Natureland, a place for families to take their children to. And the craft suddenly surges ahead and swoops down over the highway. And Barney has to stop the car directly in the middle of the road so that he won't be underneath that craft. He opens the door, he steps out, and the craft is just hanging there in the sky, silent. He described it as having the appearance of a giant pancake. And he stepped away from the car. He had binoculars. And when he did, the craft shifted to an adjacent field, and he followed it into the field. Holding the binoculars up to his eyes, he looked into the craft and he saw entities that he stated when he arrived home in a report to NICAP, and also a month later to the NICAP investigator, Walter Webb, that these entities were, quote, somehow not human. Suddenly, all but one turned and walked toward what Barney thought was a panel. And when they did, their arms went up. He could see them now from the tops of their heads, just above that, to their knees. And when their arms went up, something happened. Little lights started to slide out from the sides of the craft, and something started to drop down from the bottom of the craft. And he had the immediate sense that they had a plan, and that plan was to capture him like, quote, a bug in a net, close quote. That is when he became terrified. He tore the binoculars from his eyes and he dashed back to the car, screaming to Betty that they had to get out of there or they were going to be captured. And as he threw himself into the car in terror, and as was closing the door, he noticed that the craft was now headed in his direction. He started speeding down the highway. He told Betty to roll down the window and look up. He thought the craft was overhead. She did. She was expecting to see lights. All she saw was blackness, even though it was a bright light night. And almost immediately, she and Barney heard a series of code-like buzzing sounds striking the trunk of the car. Their bodies began to tingle, and the car began to vibrate. The next thing they knew, they were 35 miles down the highway. They had vague memories of finding themselves on a dirt road, not the road they'd been on. There were tall trees all around. There was a roadblock. There was a fiery orb that appeared to be sitting on the ground. And now they're 35 miles down the road, and they hear a second series of buzzing sounds. Betty looks again. There is no craft to be seen. Barney, still in denial, says to Betty, I can prove it's not a flying saucer. I'm going to stop this car. I can make that noise. So he stopped the car on the road. He drove it from side to side. He did everything he could to try to make that noise.
Right.
And he couldn't do it. So, but Betty loved it when she was right.
That's too funny.
So they just drove on home, sort of scratching their heads about the whole thing. When they arrived home, they found evidence that something had happened. Betty's best dress was torn. It was torn from waist to hemline. On the lining, the hem was torn down on one side. The back of the dress at the zipper was torn. There was a 2-inch tear in the stitching and a 1-inch tear in the thick zipper fabric. Barney's best dress shoes were so deeply scraped that he had to buy new shoes. There were shiny spots on the trunk of the car that caused a compass needle to spin and spin, indicating a magnetic field. Only when he placed the compass over those spots. They had not been there the day before. They were there when they arrived home. The watches that they were wearing that night, wind-up watches, stopped running and never ran again. And the binocular strap, the leather binocular strap, was severed. And, that must have happened when he so violently tore those binoculars from his eyes in terror, running for the car. So, all of these mysteries, knowing that something they couldn't explain had happened, they were missing time. They arrived home 2 hours later than they anticipated. Even though they were familiar with that area, they knew how long it should have taken. They had looked at their watches when they were operating properly. So many, many mysteries. And they made a report to Pease Air Force Base, a Project Blue Book report. Um, They ended up a little more than 2 years later being referred to Dr. Benjamin Simon, a renowned psychiatrist who had set up the psychiatric unit at the Mason General Hospital on Long Island during World War II and had great success in working with veterans who were returning with shell shock and conversion hysteria. And he sort of specialized in that throughout his career as a psychiatrist and neuropsychiatrist. And he was written up in Who's Who in America. He was the head of the Psychiatric Association. He had an outstanding career. And there was even a movie made about the success of his work during World War II. So he was a very good person for Betty and Barney to go to, because Barney had post-traumatic stress disorder, what they used to call shell shock, and a bleeding ulcer, and physiological problems that would not recede with traditional medicine. So that would have been like conversion hysteria during World War II, but it was this craft and this abduction that they found out occurred that caused Barney to experience such distress.
So you mentioned, in 61, Betty contacts the Air Force shortly after this happens, and they didn't go public in 1963. Did they ever talk about the reasoning behind that? Was it embarrassment, or was it just they didn't know where to go, the possible repercussions of ridicule, that kind of thing?
Betty and Barney never intended to go public with their story. They were both activists in the civil rights movement. Barney was black, Betty was white. They were members of the NAACP. Barney was on the local and regional boards. In 1965, Barney was appointed to the U.S. Commission on Civil Rights State Advisory Committee. This was a huge political position. He was known throughout the state. They had absolutely no intention of going public. He worked for the post office.
Right.
Betty was a social worker for the state of New Hampshire. No good could come of having this story made public.
Yeah, and actually that was one of the questions I wanted to ask. We're talking the early 60s here. Interracial couples really wasn't that big of a thing in the United States, let alone up here in, the Atlantic states and New England. So I can only imagine how they would have just said, let's just let this go under the rug. But eventually they decided to move forward. Let's talk a little bit about what actually got them to get to that point where they said, we really need to talk about this.
Well, what happened was there was a violation of confidentiality.
Oh, boy.
Yes, very unfortunate for Betty and Barney and for my family, too. It was extremely distressing that a friend of Betty's, I did find out later, I have a letter indicating that she is the person, went to a newspaper reporter in Boston and spoke to him about what had actually happened to Betty and Barney. He had gotten in touch with the Hills and used her name in a letter and said that he would love to speak with them. And he promised that he would never do anything with this commercially, even though he was a writer. And Betty and Barney still said, no, we don't want to talk with anyone about this. They were talking to scientists. They were talking confidentially to UFO investigators. Their friends knew about this as well as the family, but they certainly did not want the story carried to the public. But the newspaper reporter ignored their pleas, and in late October of 1965, their story was published in the Boston Traveler for 5 days in a row.
Oh, wow.
And it brought the media to Portsmouth, New Hampshire, and they were outside the post office. They were outside the welfare office where Betty worked. And so the first night they escaped to Pease Air Force Base. They had a friend who was an officer there. And then I guess it must have been the second night that they came to my neighborhood in Kingston, New Hampshire. I lived across the street from my grandparents, who were Betty's parents. And we all met as a family and talked through this and decided where they should go from there. And we decided that since the story had already been revealed, and not entirely accurately, that they would speak. And so about a week later, they gave their first lecture. They were introduced by the public information officer from Pease Air Force Base. The lecture was held in the Unitarian Church in Dover, New Hampshire, to an overflow crowd. It was a cold night. It was sleeting, and people were standing outside in the cold waiting to get in. The basement of the church was filled. They set up speakers, and people were outside listening. There was so much interest in this, and Betty and Barney were amazed because they were not fired from their jobs. Many people actually believed them. They knew them. They knew that they wouldn't imagine this and they wouldn't make this up. So they were pretty well received, and we're happy with that initially.
Kathleen Marden, my guest here on The Edge of the Unknown. She is the niece of Betty and Barney Hill. We are talking about their case tonight. We're going to be getting into a number of other different subjects as the show goes on. And again, I appreciate her taking some time out to be on this episode. Do you think that even in that time in the 50s and 60s, you know, Project Blue Book is going on, people are seeing all kinds of things in the skies. Do you think that had something to do with the openness of everyone wanting to hear from someone else, probably to validate their own feelings that they were having and the things that they might have seen?
It could be. I mean, I don't know. When Betty and Barney spoke in Dover, they didn't talk about their abduction. They only spoke about their close encounter with the craft.
Right.
And, you know, people were very, very interested, apparently, in that time frame. I have done a great deal of research on the history of UFOs, the government involvement in the investigation of UFOs, their findings, the reports that were made by hundreds of people all across America and overseas in that time frame. So there was a lot of public interest, apparently.
So not too much longer after their first, when they talked to everybody out there and after what we just talked about and the further investigations, Barney passed away at a pretty young age. And I believe he was 46.
Yes.
Which is right where I'm at in life. And if I'm out of line on this, just tell me, hey, I'm not going to answer any kind of questions about that. But was it ever talked about that his death might have been something that involved this interaction that they had with this craft and these aliens? Or is that just like too conspiracy theory or cosmic coming out of my mouth?
I think it's too conspiracy theory, to tell you the truth.
Sure.
Barney was involved in an explosion during World War II,
Mm-hmm.
for one thing. And I have a neighbor who is a medical doctor, and he was in the Army. He was over as a doctor in Iraq, and he was involved in an explosion, and he ended up having a stroke
Hmm.
um, because of the impact that it had on the veins in his head. So, Barney already had probably a weakness from the percussion
Sure.
explosion. The strokes ran in his family. His father died from a stroke. And Barney was under a great deal of pressure.
Hmm.
He was never happy that this was made public. He always found it distressing, even though he went forward and told the truth about what happened to him. Um, he always put civil rights first.
Hmm.
His political interests were number one for Barney, and he continued to carry on with that. But of course, the first book about their case was based on the hypnosis tapes, was written in 1966.
Mm-hmm.
So he had to work on the publicity on that book that John Fuller wrote. And uh, that placed a lot of pressure. He had just so many irons in the fire and so much interest from scientists who were continuing to visit and listen to the hypnosis tapes and look at this case too.
And I actually, you've been on this show twice before, and I don't think I've ever asked you this question. And did Betty and Barney have kids, and how might this have affected them? The reason I ask that is pretty recently, one of my favorite podcasts, the Joe Rogan Experience podcast, had MMA fighter Angela Hill on, and she says that she was Barney's granddaughter. And I had never heard of that before and thought, gee, if I can ask about that, did they have kids? And
Barney had two sons
okay,
by his first marriage.
okay, right. So then,
Betty adopted children, her first husband's children.
okay,
So yes, and so I don't think that she was born before Barney died.
hmm,
I'm not positive of that. I don't remember her being mentioned.
okay.
But yes, apparently she is the daughter of one of Barney's sons.
One of Barney's sons. No kidding. Look at that. Wow. And Joe is such a great interviewer. I love Joe, and I've got to actually I've tagged him in a couple of times in this podcast. I'll get into that in a little bit because it involves Stan Friedman, who we'll talk about in a couple of minutes here. But before we start talking about the Zeta Reticuli stuff that Betty really kind of outlined, what was it like growing up with Betty and Barney? I mean, did you see them a lot? Holidays, summer stuff, that kind of thing?
I saw Betty and Barney at least once a week.
No kidding.
Maybe
Wow.
more often than that. We were a close family.
Yeah.
And they were like a second set of parents to me. I did so many things with them, going to museums, just visiting at my grandparents' farm across the street from my childhood home. The three of us were invited to Lyndon Johnson's inauguration and went
Wow.
there together.
Oh, that's rad.
Out to dinner. We were a very close family.
That's awesome. How neat. That's really cool. Because again, another question that I've never asked you, but so let's go back to what I just kind of mentioned. The whole Zeta. I forget what I mean, Betty said she saw a star map, and it turns out that it was a real thing. Can you talk a little bit about what she saw and what she shared with the investigators when she finally did share what she had experienced?
Yes, I'd be happy to. When Betty was on the craft, after her examination had been completed and she had gotten dressed, she turned to the one that she called the leader and she said, I know you're not from around here. Where's your home port? And because he was kind of sort of a cross between a human and a gray, what you would think of. And so he produced this star map that she said was almost like looking out a window into the sky. I don't know if it was a holographic image or what it was. That was never really determined.
Sure.
But on that map, there were a number of stars. There were 2 in the foreground that were as large as nickels. And then there were many others, smaller, some small circles, some just dots. Some were connected by solid lines. And Betty was made to understand that those were trade routes, places where these entities traveled frequently, and that the dotted lines were expeditions. So Dr. Benjamin Simon said to Betty under hypnosis, if you can draw this accurately, and if it doesn't trouble you too much, go home and sketch it and bring it back to me the next time you come in. And she did. It was sort of almost like automatic writing in a sense, that she just knew what to do. After she had drawn it, she started thinking about it, and she erased one of those stars and moved it. I don't know if she moved it back, maybe. But anyway, that star map ended up being published in the first book, The Interrupted Journey, by John G. Fuller, published in 1966. And it's also encaptured the Betty and Barney Hill UFO experience now. But in 1966, Marjorie Fish read the book. She was a brilliant woman from Ohio. At that time, she was a school teacher. She went on to be a research assistant at a nuclear laboratory. And she was an amateur astronomer. She also was a member of Mensa, meaning that she had a high IQ. So she started going to the library. Remember, no computers back then. She had to sit down with the astronomical catalogs, and she couldn't even photocopy them. She had to use a paper and pen and write down all of the characteristics of all of the stars in our galactic neighborhood out 55 light years in every direction from our sun.
Wow.
And then she took all that information back to her house, and she started to build 3-dimensional models using frames and monofilament line and beads of various sizes and colors. Now, her brilliance in all of this was that she had to do the math to know where to place every one of those stars in its proper location.
Oh, man.
In the galactic neighborhood. And she did it accurately. She still didn't have a match. She started this 67, and she still didn't have a match in 1971. But she was persistent. She had built 14 different models in all directions in that time frame. And then she went back to the university, and a new catalog had been published, and it had some new distance data. And so there were stars now that were within 55 light years that had previously been outside of the range that she was looking at.
Wow.
And so she had that distance data. She put those stars on the map, and she had a match. So then this is where Stanton Friedman came in. Because Marjorie had written to Coral Lorenzen, who is the director of the Aerial Phenomena Research Organization. And Coral had asked Stanton to meet with Marjorie when he was in Ohio. He had, at that point, stopped working as a nuclear physicist and was lecturing. So he did end up lecturing in Ohio. He met with Marjorie. He spoke with her. He talked to her about her work, and he was very impressed by her level of intelligence, by her methodology, and he was willing to find scientists who would vet her work. And he did find Alan Hynek, Dr. J. Allen Hynek, who had been the astronomical consultant to Project Blue Book, and who was now the head of the Dearborn laboratory at Northwestern University, and head of the physics department. And also David Saunders, who worked on the Condon project. He was the guy who leaked the trick letter that Robert Lowe, project coordinator, had written regarding the trick would be to make the public think this was a serious study. And when in fact the scientists would have almost no expectation of finding a UFO. And so David Saunders was a statistician who looked at Marjorie's work. And then we had a Dr. Mitchell, and he was at Ohio State University in the physics department, an astronomer, and he had his students. By this time, there were computers. So he had his students do computerized models of Marjorie's work, and all agreed that her work was reasonably close, close enough that they accepted it.
Wow.
Now, the big finding in all of this was that all of the stars on Betty's star map were sun-like stars, even though only 5% of the stars in that volume of space were sun-like, and all of the sun-like stars in that volume of space were on Betty's map. Unbelievable. That, I mean, so far beyond coincidence that this would happen. Also, when astronomers looked at it, they discovered that if they were going to travel from Zeta Reticuli to Earth, or from Earth to Zeta, the star system Zeta Reticuli, that is the flight path they would take going from one solar system to another for a stop. So there were many remarkable things about this map that caused scientists to believe that Betty had actually had this experience.
Kathleen Marden, my guest here on The Edge of the Unknown. We have to take a quick break, but we're going to have lots more coming back right after this short, brief. Hopefully it's not too long. It's only about 3 minutes. And we just got to make sure that we're paying some bills here and making sure that some folks out there are being able to advertise here, which is kind of a rare thing now that everybody's going through the COVID-19 thing. But some of them maybe are restaurants that you might want to actually hit up because they all are doing curbside deliveries. Anyway, we're going to do that. More with Kathleen Marden coming up after this, and we're going to continue to talk about Stan Friedman. I'm glad that Kathleen just brought up Stanton because he is a friend of the show, and that's what we'll do when we're back right after this. Thanks for listening to The Edge of the Unknown, everybody. We're back in just a second.
Looking for the best Japanese and Thai cuisine in Western New York? Then you have to visit Teton Kitchen at 415 Dick Road in Depew. From appetizers and soups, simple, special, big, and fusion-style maki, to sushi, sashimi, and tempura, you won't get a range of items like this anywhere. Hungry for more? Teton Kitchen offers a full dinner menu and kushiyaki dishes, as well as a huge variety of sake, wine, beer, both domestic and Asian imports. Owner Taka and his bride Kin are proud to boast that Teton Kitchen is Yelp's #1 rated restaurant in Western New York, and they welcome you for lunch or dinner 7 days a week with takeout and online ordering available. Visit TetonKitchen.com for their full menu, hours, and online ordering, or call 716-393-3720. Teton Kitchen, 415 Dick Road in Depew.
Itadakimasu.
Hi, we're the Goo Goo Dolls. We're fortunate that our daughters have what they need to grow and learn. But that isn't the case for nearly 13 million kids in the U.S. that struggle with hunger.
Childhood hunger is a heartbreaking reality that Feeding America is working to change.
Each year, the Feeding America network of food banks rescues billions of pounds of good food that would have gone to waste and provides it to families and children in need.
You can help kids in need in your community by visiting feedingamerica.org.
Brought to you by Feeding America and the Ad Council.
For those interested in delving deep into the paranormal, why not look into the Paratech Store? Located at paratechstore.com, browsers will find the latest in investigative equipment, books, and more. Items go beyond technical equipment. Mojo bags, stone sets, and other curiosities await your exploration at the Paratech Store. paratechstore.com. Visit them today.
Hi, my name is Stanton Friedman, the Flying Saucer Physicist. I've just been on The Edge of the Unknown.
We're back here on The Edge of the Unknown. This episode, we are speaking with Kathleen Marden. She is a lecturer. She is an author. She is one of the foremost authorities on UFOs and alien interaction. We've kind of mentioned some of her books, and we need to mention her website again. It's Kathleen, Kathleen, Marden, Marden.com. Go there for all of the information that we're talking about tonight. All of the books that she's written are there, and everything that she's up to and what she's going to be up to. Unfortunately, a lot of stuff has been put on hold with what we've been going through here with the COVID-19 pandemic, but that is your one-stop shop for everything that we are talking about this evening. We're talking about her books, Captured the Betty and Barney Hill UFO Experience, Science Was Wrong, and Facts, Fiction, and Flying Saucers. Before we took a break, Kathleen brought up nuclear physicist and one of the neatest guys I've ever had the opportunity to talk to on repeated occasions, Stanton Friedman. Unfortunately, Stanton left this world back in 2019, and Stan had been on this show 4 times. And I tell you what, for a guy who lived in a different time zone and would never shirk from a 3-hour show, the first time that I had him on, the second time that I had him on, then I think the third and fourth time I went back to 2 hours, and it was a little bit earlier in the evening. He never once said no. One of the neatest guys I've ever had the chance to have on the show, and who has done lots of work with my guest this evening, Kathleen Marden. So I have to say this, Kathleen, because I kind of made a little inference earlier in the night, and I actually talked about one of my favorite podcasts, Joe Rogan. Joe Rogan had Dan Aykroyd on, who is a huge UFO enthusiast. I guess that's the best way to say it. Obviously, everybody knows him from his acting and his comedy. But on his podcast, when he had Dan Aykroyd on, Joe said, geez, you know what? I feel so bad. I always wanted to have Stan Friedman on. And I look at that and go, hey, you know what, Joe? I had him on 4 times, baby. I would never say that to Joe's face because he's an MMA guy. He would put me in a pretzel if I ever did that. But I always laugh about that. So let's before we'll come back to your aunt and uncle, Betty and Barney Hill, and their abduction. But let's switch up gears for just a little second and talk about Stan. And like I said, he's been on the show. How did you guys meet outside of what you were talking about with his investigation with the star maps and that sort of thing? When did you first meet him? And what was the spark for the books that you published together?
Well, I have to tell you, I met him for the first time in 1971.
Okay, so that
when
was
he was speaking at the University of New Hampshire about UFOs are real.
So that was it, right? Nice.
And I had graduated in 1971. I must have been home for the Christmas holidays, and he came to the university, and I went to his lecture. And that was the moment that I fell in love with his work. And, he was a wonderful lecturer. He was probably the best I've ever heard. He was funny. He was highly intelligent. He took on the bad guys and did a great job at it. He did his homework, and he was just fantastic to work with. And Betty, after Betty's death, I had been working for many, many years on my investigation of that case. I had gone over with Betty all of the events that I had taken part in with Betty, UFO sightings and other things. And I had been since 1991 uh, investigating that case on my own. In fact, my husband and I at one point drove the entire route that Betty and Barney drove that night,
no kidding.
stopping at the same spots.
Wow.
Oh yeah, I was extraordinarily thorough.
Sure.
And I had all of Betty's archival records too. And I was coming along well on my manuscript when I realized that I did not want to write chapters on the star map research. I'm an investigator who does not go to somebody else's investigations for information. I do my own investigations. And I knew if I tackled astronomy and that star map, it was going to take me years. And so Betty had said to me, if you need any help with any of this, talk to Stanton Friedman. I trust him implicitly. So I decided that I would talk with Stanton. We had actually done a television show together, probably in late 2004, early 2005. And then I met up with him again at the MUFON Symposium in Denver, Colorado. And I almost didn't invite him to work with me because I wanted to speak with him in person. And every time I went to his table, his vendor table, there was a group of very tall men standing around the table. I could hardly see through to Stanton. And I just frankly gave up. And I was disappointed, but I thought, oh, well, who knows? Maybe I won't even put the star map into the book. And finally, at the end of the day on Sunday, after the symposium had ended, I thought I'll take one last trip to the vendor room. And there was Stanton all alone, packing his leftover books and papers into suitcases. And I approached the table and said, I'd really like to speak with you if you have time. And he said, what about? And I said, I've written a book and I'd like to talk to you about it. Maybe you could help me with it. And he said, have you had dinner? And I said, no. So we went into the hotel dining room and sat and talked for hours. And he was very intrigued about my work, but he wouldn't agree to work with me until he went to my house. I was living in New Hampshire at the time. So he drove down from New Brunswick and stayed a few days with my husband and myself and went through all of my files, read my manuscript. I gave him photocopies of anything he wanted. We talked for hours, and finally he said to me that he would be interested in joining me on the book because I was being scientific and careful about what I did, and he thought that the quality of my work was very good. And so that is how our union began, and we got along so well together. He was a joy. I loved being with him, and I think he was my greatest fan. And so we wrote 3 books together and worked at many conferences together as well.
Yeah, he was just, like I said, when I first got off the ground with The Edge of the Unknown on a local radio station here, WECK, I'm doing Sunday nights, 9 to midnight. Wow, what a great shift, which was actually probably by design at that time. But when I reached out to him, and you as well, everyone has always been so open to talking and telling their stories. But Stan was just, never said no. He would always say, "Well, I'm going to be traveling, but you know what? I'll fit you in somehow." And he always
Hmm.
was that kind of guy. What a just a neat guy. I remember when he had his heart attack. I sent him a card, and I didn't expect to hear back from him. And it was actually I found it. It was two little mice with astronaut helmets on, and inside it said, "You didn't tell us the aliens were mice." And I thought, well, this will be funny, and maybe he'll get a kick out of that. And he wrote back. I was like, who would do that? He was just such a neat guy. So
He
let's,
was.
yeah, he was. Let's talk about the process of writing a book with someone else. How is that? How does that work? Where you're writing something and they're writing something? How do you come to get everything together to make sure that you're both on the same page of saying what you want to say?
Well, each book was a little bit different. He wrote his two chapters in Captured, and I wrote my chapters, and he vetted my work for accuracy, and I went over his work and tried to reword it a little bit so that it fit more into my writing style. But that was the first book we wrote together. The second book, Science Was Wrong,
Hmm.
we had worked on from the very beginning together, meeting over the telephone and talking about what we should write about, how we should write. Um, we finally agreed on our chapters and how we would place them. Each of us had 7 chapters. So there would be 14 chapters in the book. And we would gather our work, we would write our chapters and send them to the other person. But we would take all of our work with us. And when we worked at conferences, we would spend our free time after the conferences every day going over our work, over our manuscript, discussing it, looking for typos, looking for punctuation errors, whatever we needed, looking to see if there was anything needed to be developed more. And by the time we ended up writing Fact, Fiction, and Flying Saucers, we worked together like clockwork. We didn't
Hmm.
even have to speak to one another to know what the other should do.
That's awesome.
Um, we went to the American Philosophical Society together to do a lot of our research there. When he had that heart attack, he was supposed to go with me, but obviously he couldn't. So I had to make that trip alone, but I sent him all of the files and records that I was able to photocopy. And the way we worked it is that I planned most of the chapters in the book. I knew what he wanted. I knew where I wanted to place them. And we wrote that entire book together. And so I would write part of a chapter and I would tell him what I was looking for because I knew what his work was, what he had done. And so we would discuss it. He would send me his paragraphs and I would insert his paragraphs into the chapters. So this book was really a process where every chapter was written by both of us.
Wow, that sounds like a band who really wants to make a song really sing and they bang it out bar by bar by bar rather than just, hey, let's all get into a room and go nuts. It sounds like there was actually a really well thought out plan for that. That's amazing.
It is amazing, and it was so wonderful to work that way together. And I'm very proud of that book. I think it's one of our best accomplishments. It tells the history of government involvement in the investigation of UFOs, all of their major studies, their findings, the decision to cover up the findings, and those who were involved in the cover up, and what they did to case after case through the history of UFO sightings.
Kathleen Marden, my guest here on The Edge of the Unknown. Hope everybody is enjoying this episode. Much more cool episodes coming down the line. If you are enjoying this, you're going to enjoy the ones that are up and coming. But this is a blast to have Kathleen on. And again, the books that we're mentioning right now, you can go to her website right now, Kathleen-Marden, MARDEN.com. And there's ways to purchase all that stuff right there and find out what Kathleen is up to. So I do want to talk about your latest book. And, before we get into more of the government stuff that I know that I kind of told you that I wanted to touch on during this episode, let's talk about your latest book, Extraterrestrial Contact: What to Do When You've Been Abducted. Let's talk about the genesis of that.
Well, I don't know if you know this, but I am the Mutual UFO Network's Director of Experiencer Research.
Yes.
And we have a team of 43 people now.
Wow.
5 of those people are mental health professionals. We have 1 research consultant, and the remainder of the team works in a supportive role with experiencers on a day-to-day basis. Most of them are also UFO investigators. They're specialists in ET contact. So when they go in to investigate a case, they know a lot about this topic. And it makes a huge difference in an investigation. They are also there to be in a supportive role if the individual is looking for temporary support, or if they're looking for support groups, or they want to contact a vetted hypnotherapist or psychotherapist in case they have post-traumatic stress disorder. People who believe that UFO and UFO abductions are real and work with individuals. So we do a very important service. But I wrote this book because so many people would benefit from having a handbook that they can go to. And in fact, I had titled the book The Experiencer's Handbook, but my publisher always has the right to retitle it. They said, no one will know what Experiencer's Handbook means. So extraterrestrial contact, what to do when you've been abducted. But some members of my team, 3 brilliant women, and I wrote a comprehensive guide for people who have experienced contact or UFO abductions, how to work through this. I talk about some very, very interesting investigations that I have worked on, the best that aren't already in my book, The Alien Abduction Files, with Denise Stoner. Denise is a paranormal specialist, and there's a lot of overlap between the paranormal and contact. The 2 major things are light orbs that appear to have intelligence that are seen in experiencers' homes. About 65 of experiencers, 65%, say that they have seen these in their homes. Sometimes they pop into full-size extraterrestrials, and or non-humans at least. And also the sensation that something unseen is walking on the bed. That's about 65% too. So Denise wrote a couple of chapters about that. What happens if you find out that it isn't really ET? And another chapter on aliens, demons, and parasites. We have a psychotherapist on our team who wrote How to Cope with Contact by Non-Human Entities. We have another person who is a psychic detective, and she was a psychologist. And she has written a chapter on the steps you go through in learning to cope as you work through this, and also on the way that people become psychic when they have these experiences. So I've written most of the chapters here. I've written on what to do if you wanted to stop, coping strategies, and resistance techniques. I've wrote a chapter on going public. What if you want to take your story to the public? What should you do? What can you expect? I wrote a chapter on um, my attitude toward all of this. Who's an abductee? Who's a contactee? Um, they're all experiencers, in my opinion, and I use the term experiencer because John Mack coined that term. Dr. John Mack from Harvard University, who was a major uh, researcher of all of this, and I knew him, and I believe that people are entitled to call themselves whatever they want. If they've been abducted, they're entitled to be an abductee.
Mm-hmm.
If they have initiated contact, if they're having positive experiences, call themselves contactees if they want. I have a chapter on how to investigate your own experiences, what to do, what equipment you can purchase, so that you can find out for yourself if this is really happening to you, and how to document it. So that's a really important one, because so many people come to the team and say, I think that this is going on, but I'm not really certain. These are all the memories that I have. Some people have had dreams that seem too real to have been dreams, but then about 75% of all people who have been abducted and their families have had encounters with UFOs at 500 feet or less, and also have observed non-human entities. And we found out that this is generational, that it runs in families. So I wrote a great deal about that in the book too. So it's really a comprehensive guide. There's a worksheet at the end of every chapter to help people to work through their experiences.
How interesting. You know, we started off talking about your aunt and uncle, Betty and Barney Hill. For lack of a better term, they're the first couple who have ever talked about being abducted and their experiences. When did things go from, hey, this guy or gal is a kook, to this person has a worthwhile story and we need to listen to this? I would say that your aunt and uncle set the bar. And then after that, there seemed to be like this time where everybody was just like, well, yeah, he's just, who knows where he was or that. And now you've written this book to actually reach out to people and say, no, you're not crazy. That probably did happen.
I think that's really important, because the disinformants, the debunkers, the nasty skeptics did a lot of harm to people. And these people didn't ask for this to happen. It did happen. They didn't go public with it. It was carried to the public without their approval. I think of Travis Walton, who was so young when he had his experience, and how Philip Klass was there immediately debunking him, making him look like a liar. This is a young man who is highly traumatized by what has happened to him. I observed Travis carrying stress in his body for years and years and years, until he finally came to the conclusion that this was not a bad experience that he had. They took him onto that craft because he'd been injured, and it was probably a rescue mission to save his life. They didn't put him back down in the cold November woods in the mountains of Arizona. They put him down at the edge of a town where he could seek safety. So they were kind to him, and he finally realized that. But he went for years and years and years facing ridicule that heaped trauma on him.
Yeah.
It's not a good thing to do, to look at somebody who's had these experiences and pass judgment on them. I don't care what anyone thinks privately. You don't have to say, I believe you, but then don't comment.
But didn't even his buddies kind of backed him up and said, yeah, something strange happened out there.
Well, not only that, they were suspected of foul play. So they had to take lie detector tests to prove their innocence while the sheriff's department was out searching
looking for Travis right.
for 5 days.
Right.
Yes.
Wow.
They all passed. Well, there was one who didn't finish the lie detector test. So, but the part that he did take, he passed. Everyone else passed.
Unbelievable. But I just think it's interesting that we're now in an age, and we're going to take a quick break here, and we're going to get back into some of the stuff that the government has released recently. But I think it's interesting that we're now in an age that even 15, 20 years ago, it was, these people are crazy. He was out high or whatever. He had a couple of too many Mai Tais and wandered into something silly. But now we're taking it seriously, where people actually probably do need some of this guidance. So when we get back with my guest here, Kathleen Marden, I want to talk about what she does with hypnosis. And I also want to talk about all the stuff that's coming out from the government now. As we talk about UFOs, we talk about alien abduction. Kathleen Marden, Kathleen-Marden.com. My guest here on The Edge of the Unknown. Everybody stick around. We'll be back right after this.
We all face multiple stressors each day, from work deadlines and home and family obligations, not to mention body aches and pains that come with both active and inactive lifestyles. A great way to ease those tensions is by floating at the Silver Essence Floating Spa in Williamsville, New York. What is floating? It's a highly effective and therapeutic relaxation experience in which your body is suspended in warm, comforting salt water without stimulation from lights or sounds. Lay back and let tension drift away as you float in nearly zero gravity while your body is replenished with essential minerals like magnesium, potassium, sodium, and calcium, minerals vital to our health that are lost throughout the day. Floating at the Silver Essence Floating Spa is great for anyone, athletes, those rehabilitating from injury, or if you're just looking for a new way to relax. Floating is even known to increase creativity and speed up the healing process. Silver Essence is open Monday through Saturday with convenient morning and evening hours, and they offer infrared sauna treatments, membership deals, special packages, and much more. Check them out online at silveressencefloatingspa.com or call 716-568-7985. Conveniently located in downtown Williamsville. They're just minutes from anywhere. That's the Silver Essence Floating Spa. Get your float on and tell them you heard about them on The Edge of the Unknown.
The Hope Project of Western New York is a resource for struggling families often identified as the working poor. We assist individuals who have lost their jobs through no fault of their own, disabled individuals, households with special needs members, victims of domestic violence in transition, and our military families and veterans. The Hope Project provides our members with gently used clothing, household supplies and toys, as well as hygiene and cleaning supplies. We also make available specialty items like prom dresses and Halloween costumes. These items are provided at zero cost to our members. How can you help? By donating items at our storefront, 4545 Transit Road in Williamsville, New York, inside the Eastern Hills Mall. Store hours, Monday 10 to 2, Tuesday 11 to 2, Wednesday 10 to 8, Thursday 10 to 2, and Saturday 10 to 2. Closed on all school holidays. Clothing should be contemporary, free of stains and tears, and household items must be in good condition and in working order. We also accept grocery and department store gift cards, as well as monetary donations. You can also help out by becoming a volunteer. For more information, visit our website at thehopeprojectofwny.org or call us at 716-810-9156. The Hope Project of Western New York. Dignified help for those in need.
Why was the basketball court all wet? Because the players kept dribbling on it.
The dad joke. Corny, groan-worthy, but also one of the simplest ways to share a moment with your kids.
What did the buffalo say when he dropped his son off at school? Bye, son.
So take a moment to make your kid laugh, because dad jokes rule. Make your kid laugh today. Go to fatherhood.gov. Brought to you by the U.S. Department of Health and Human Services and the Ad Council.
This is Dr. Bruce Maccabee, and you're listening to The Edge of the Unknown with Mark Henry.
Hey, everybody. Thanks for listening to The Edge of the Unknown. My guest on this episode is Kathleen Marden. Go to her website, Kathleen-Marden.com, for all the books that you've heard about so far through this podcast. And check some of them out. They're really, really cool. I have 2 of them. I do not have the latest one, which I'm going to have to remedy that this week. We actually just talked about that in the last segment, Extraterrestrial Contact: What to Do When You've Been Abducted. But go to the website and buy it there. That's the best way to do it. If you can't do that, go to your favorite bookstore, and I'm sure, of course, it's also available on Amazon and elsewhere. But Kathleen, thank you so much for doing this. This is the 3rd time you've been on. You've been such an awesome sport for staying up a little bit late when we do these things. But I really appreciate you taking the time to be here.
Well, I enjoy the conversation, so I'm happy to be with you.
So as I said before we took the break, I wanted to kind of go back to your Aunt Betty and Uncle Barney. But did I just call her Aunt Betty? She's not my Aunt Betty. Well, I might as well get famous. I'll get famous with her too, right? Anyway, my apologies. Your Aunt Betty continued to seek out UFO activities for quite some years after all of this happened, and long after, her husband passed away, your Uncle Barney. She was still really into the UFO phenomenon, right?
Yes, she was. This all started when she wrote, after the hypnosis, to 2 of the early investigators, scientific investigators. And they spoke to her about the possibility of doing psychophysics experiments with them. And she agreed to do it. And so they would give her a script, and she would have to go out every night at the same time and send telepathic messages from that script to these non-human entities to try to instruct them to go to a certain place and show themselves, or go to a certain place and land. And she was so intrigued by the success that she had doing that, that even after the experiments ended, she continued to go out looking at UFOs herself. Um, so that's kind of it in a nutshell. I've written about it in great detail in my book, Captured.
Mhm.
But that's what she did. And she drew later on a lot of criticism because the debunkers decided that they would have a field day with Betty and really destroy her credibility. After Barney died, they did terrible things to her. I don't know if it was debunkers or who it was, but her house was being broken into.
Oh, wow.
I was a college student living at her house.
Wow.
And in a different apartment. She owned an apartment house, but we kept the doors open between our apartments, and there were some weird things that took place in that house. I've written about it in Captured too, but it was very difficult for Betty with the things they did. Let me give you an example.
Sure,
she had prepared
please.
all of her tax records to go to her accountant. She had them all gathered together and was going to take them to work and go directly from work to the accountant's office to drop them off. They were missing. And she had to ask for an extension. They finally were returned, but not in a container that she left them in. They were scattered all over the floor throughout her apartment. And, there were these kinds of things that were being done to frighten Betty or to make her look kooky. People were, I think, hoping that she would talk about this and the public would say, oh, she's just a crazy old woman.
Mm-hmm.
Don't believe a word she said. And they did it over and over again. And it remained a secret until I wrote about it in Captured after Betty's death. But I saw this happening too, and I'm not a kook. And I would swear on the Bible in a court of law that I saw these things happening to Betty. Her phone was tapped. She ended up having an alarm system, one of the first alarm systems, put on her house that rang in the police station. And it did occur one time, and the police came, and that was the last time her house was broken into.
Wow. Now, do you think I got to before we segue into perhaps governmental interference? Do you think that it was just the debunkers or the people who were refuting whatever she said, or do you think that there might have been something else going on to discredit her that might have been a higher level? You know, we always talk about the men in black and the people who don't want you to know, and it's the Illuminati or whatever you want to put a label on. What do you think it actually was? Was it just people that didn't want her to talk, or was it people that maybe were trying to just do what they normally do? And James Randi, but I didn't say that out loud.
Phil Glass.
Whoa, I get to say that. But what do you really chalk it up to be? What do you think was actually going on?
Well, if you read my book, Fact, Fiction, and Flying Saucers, you'll find out that Philip Glass was very closely connected to the federal government, and so was Dr. Donald Menzel. And so were some of the other high-level people that we used to think were debunkers, but they were disinformants. They were working for someone. And so I believe that it was a government agency, a three-letter agency, who was doing this to Betty.
Unreal.
She had deadbolt locks on her house. People couldn't get in there. There was no sign of breaking and entering.
But they still
did.
Somebody
had a key to get in.
Somebody still was able to do it, right?
Yes.
Oh, my gosh. Well, rock me to sleep tonight. I'm glad to. So let's transition from that. Quick segue to the recently released videos and radar footage that everyone has been talking about for so long. I mean, it hasn't just popped up. I mean, we can go back 10, 15 years to guys like Commander David Fravor, other pilots from the Navy, the Air Force, these guys who have seen things but never really talked about it and have started to come out and talk about it. But recently, the ATIP stuff has made itself known all over the internet, all over YouTube. What are your thoughts about all of these things now popping up where the government is saying, yeah, there are things out there, and we have no idea what the heck they are?
Well, that reminds me of 1947, when the government had done a study on flying discs, and they discovered in the report that was written to the military general in that time frame that they were structured craft. They could outfly and outmaneuver anything that we had. They could move in aerodynamically in ways that we couldn't. And so there was as much mystery then as there is now, because the government has always secretly studied it, but denied it to the public. I think that there was a disconnect after 1969 when Project Blue Book closed down. I don't know if there are any secret studies done between then and when the study began in 2004, I believe it was. And it was just really a very interesting study that they did. the study was done between 2007 and 2012, and it was done with funding by Senate Majority Leader Harry Reid through the Defense Spending Subcommittee. It wasn't a lot of money, only $22 million over 5 years, but they started out with a very interesting study on the Skinwalker Ranch in Utah.
Yep.
And they funded Robert Bigelow from Bigelow Aerospace to form a scientific committee to go there and to study the strange phenomena that is occurring on that ranch. I am fascinated by that because I've done an investigation of an airport in the Southwest where the same kinds of things were happening. And I wrote about it in my new book. You'll read it in Extraterrestrial Contact.
Awesome.
So, they were using, say, in the Nimitz sighting in 2004, they were using what the Navy called the most advanced radar in the world, Super Hornet radar, off the coast of San Diego. And these craft, just as they had been doing from the early days, could outfly and outmaneuver anything that we could do, way beyond our aerodynamic principles. And they wondered if maybe that was indicative of a vacuum environment. They saw the craft hover in the sky at 80,000 feet, and it could stay there in place for hours. And then in a second, or maybe a couple of seconds, it could drop from 80,000 feet to 20,000 feet, and then down to 50 feet above the ocean. And the water would churn like it was boiling, and it would bounce back and forth like a ping pong ball over another object that appeared to be like it, that was under the water.
Right.
So we know that these things can fly in and out of the water.
And this is you're I think you're referring to the Tic Tac video that anybody
Yes.
if anybody wants to go and check that out, go to YouTube right now and just type in UFO Tic Tac and you're going to find it. It's unbelievable. And it's real. That's the most amazing thing. It's like, this is not a fake, guy in his basement, kind of like what I'm doing right now. But anyway, but it's not like a CGI thing or a college project or someone messing around. This is real footage of an aircraft that is doing things that we can't possibly explain how the heck it's doing it.
Yes, Louis Elizondo, who ran the ATIP program at the Pentagon, put in a Freedom of Information Act request in August of 2017. And the government released those videos to him. And then he took them to the New York Times, to reporters there, who wrote the first article about all of this. And it appeared on December 16, 2017. So that was the first real disclosure officially that UFOs are real.
Yeah. And again, I don't want to take away from all of the books that we've talked about and what you're doing. Have you ever done a conference or spoken with Leslie Kean?
Yes, I've spoken with her. I've been to Bud Hopkins' apartment when he was alive and visited with her. Yes, I know Leslie.
Yeah, but I just wanted to mention, because she wrote a book years ago, and she was actually on this here humble show and podcast, whatever we want to refer to it as now. And in her book, it was so many people from military organizations outside of the U.S. that were so ready to talk about it. I guess my question to you is, why did it take so long for our own government to come out and say, hey, you know what? Yeah, we did do these studies. We did talk to these people. We do have this footage. This is a real phenomenon. And why haven't they reached out to folks like you and Stan before he passed away, and guys like Don Donderi and so on? I mean, I could just list off a litany of names. All of a sudden, now it seems like this is the time to talk about it, which I'm very happy about. But where the hell were they 15, 20 years ago?
They were incapable of defending the people of the world against an alien invasion. And the military always views things as an antagonistic force. And I mean, these things have been around. If you listen to Major General John Samford in a press conference that he held in 1952. He said they'd been around since biblical times.
Right.
They haven't done any harm. They want to call them now. They don't want to call them unidentified flying objects anymore. They want to call them UAPs, unidentified aerial phenomena. If you think of phenomena, it could be anything in the sky. It doesn't have to be a structured craft. So I think that they're putting a little spin on the title of what we're going to call them. But maybe that's their out. There's still going to be, I think, some blowback. I think that they probably have the skeptics and the disinformants waiting in the wings to come in and debunk all of this if there's any public hysteria about this release. I'm not aware that there has been public hysteria so far. It's been released to the public on television shows, on the news, in newspapers, on the internet. So it's readily available, but people just go on with their lives.
It's so funny that it used to be the only time that this discussion, kind of like the one that we're having right now, ever came up, it was always on the daytime talk shows. And that's where everybody saw or got their information. And now with the advent of podcasts that have been going on for the last 20 years and the ability for folks like myself and other very talented people out there to have guests on like you, things have changed so much where people actually do have a voice, and it's not put into a 40-second, encapsulated news report or a very highly edited goofball afternoon, TV show where it is a bunch of people that you really don't know if you can actually take seriously. I think it's a fascinating way that we can all do this. And heck, we have always had Art Bell, but we also know Art Bell would take calls from guys who said they were werewolves, which is awesome. And I appreciate that. But how do you approach it with the media? When I reached out to you and said, hey, would you come back on the show? Would you come and talk and be able to have your story told without interruption and without having someone sitting on the other side of a stage who is just going to be sitting there muttering under his breath the entire time? Yeah, whatever. No, that's a lie. That didn't happen. That's not true.
So
it's got to be refreshing.
I'm happy not to have someone there who is lying and attempting to convince the people in the audience that what I'm saying is false. I can back up everything I say with evidence, and that's really important to me. So I think that we have the ability. When we're not talking in sound bites, when we have time to actually discuss all of this, when I give lectures on the same things that I talk about on radio shows and podcasts and on television shows, I show the evidence so that anyone who comes to my lectures is going to see the evidence that what I say is true. When you read my books, you're going to know where that information came from. They're all footnoted. They're well referenced. So you will know if you want to go and look up that information yourself, you'll know where to go to look it up. So I pride myself in the type of research and investigation that I do. I'm very thorough. I worked with Stanton Friedman, who was meticulous, very high IQ. He was a rocket scientist, and we held very high standards. And I continue to hold those high standards, even though he's no longer with me.
Kathleen Marden, my guest here on The Edge of the Unknown. She is the niece of Betty and Barney Hill. We have, and actually, I have links in both the podcast information and on YouTube where you can go to her website, Kathleen-Marden, Marden.com, for all the things that we've been talking about tonight. And a couple more things, and I know we've gone long over what we actually talked about, but so I do want to talk about what you've got coming up. You talked about how, geez, through all this COVID-19, there's been so many cancellations and that sort of thing. But are you working on any new books, and what can we expect from you, in 2020, at least the later part of this year, 2021, 2022? What's going on?
I have information that I want to release to the public, but I can't do it without.
You'd have to drive up here and kill me, right?
Platform where I can lecture. I even have photographs of non-humans now.
Really? Wow.
Yes.
Oh,
Yes.
God. See, again, now I'm going to be up all night wondering.
In excellent cases.
Now, are these people that have reached out to you after they read a book? Is that the way that they find you, or is it through lectures? How do people actually, say, hey, Mrs. Marden, I've got something really interesting to share or interesting to say?
Well, I think that they know about me because I'm very well known. They see me on television, and that's one place where I have a lot of visibility. Maybe they've read my books. A lot of people will go to my website and send me a message. Um, and in this big case that I have been investigating, and which is the one that has the best video of non-human entities that I've ever seen, it's two researchers, highly respected researchers, women, who were introduced to me by Stanton Friedman, who was so impressed with their work. And I set up a project for them. They were interested in going to the home of a confirmed experiencer and attempting to capture video of a craft and electronic voice phenomena. They had a number of different devices that they were using. They did have a craft come in. They did experience a couple of hours of missing time. I ended up doing the hypnosis sessions on each of them separately. And also, we're working on the video analysis of the non-human entities that were captured by the video camera that had been left running before these entities discovered that it was on
Wow.
and ducked pretty quickly.
And I'm going to lie because I want to keep you on for a couple more minutes because we didn't touch on your hypnosis and the hypnotherapy that you do. If you could talk a little bit about that, I will finally let you go and get out of your hair for at least another year before I call you back and ask if you'll come back on.
I'd be happy to. But with the hypnosis, my practice is closed right now because of the virus, but I'll open up whenever I can.
Sure.
But I use two separate different methodologies. I can use traditional hypnosis where it depends upon what the person requires. If somebody has trauma, I always want them to see a psychotherapist who does EMDR, rapid eye movement therapy, because it's highly effective with the trauma and it will help them to remember at least some of what happened to them. I will work with them in hypnosis to go through in more detail what happened in a very kind and reassuring way. They don't have to relive the trauma. I'm not a psychotherapist. I don't do it that way. They can not feel whatever it is. They can watch it and describe it. And it works pretty effectively. And we obtain a lot of information that way, and they come out feeling much better, because I've never worked with anybody under hypnosis who has ended up feeling traumatized. They remember things about the experience they had that makes them feel good about it, that makes them feel like they're not being exploited, that makes them feel like they have a relationship with these non-humans that they didn't realize before. And I'm not asking any leading questions to get them there either. I use a forensic questioning technique. It was the only technique that was permitted by law enforcement and permissible in a court of law. It isn't any longer. Hypnosis fell out of favor back in the 80s, but it's a very effective methodology, because I never ask a question unless it's pertaining to something that has already been offered by the experiencer.
Are people really out, the way that we always see it in the movies or in a television show where the person just seems to go into a trance-like state? I mean, how does it actually work?
I try to get them to go into the deepest trance possible. And that varies from person to person. It depends upon how suggestible they are, how well they can listen and take my the script that I'm offering to them for relaxation, how deeply they can relax. I find that people who meditate are much better hypnotic subjects than those who can't. People who have ADHD are not very good hypnotic subjects. People with a lot of anxiety, but people generally, they don't just come into me for hypnosis. We sit down, we talk. I've done an investigation of their experiences before I ever do hypnosis with them. I also offer the quantum healing hypnosis technique. And that was developed by Dolores Cannon, who was a past life regressionist. She developed this technique over a 40-year period. And you go beyond hypnosis, because when the hypnosis session is ended, then you access the person's higher self. And the person talks in the third person. And they have the person gives me questions they want me to ask their higher self. So I ask those questions and receive the answers. And if the individual has any physiological symptoms that they would like to have healed, then I go through a body scan very slowly, starting at the top of their head and working down their body, and ask the subconscious to heal that part of the body and to let me know when all of the cells in that area of the body have been healed. And then we move down to the next area. And believe it or not, it is effective for a lot of the people that I have worked with.
That's fascinating. I mean, honestly, to go across your entire career of what you've done, social work, you've written books, you've gone on lectures, and holy cow, you've done a lot of stuff in a pretty short amount of time. And what are we looking forward to in 2021? I know you posted something on your homepage at Kathleen-Marden.com, a possible cruise. Where else might we see you showing up outside of TV, podcasts, and radio shows? What might you be doing in the next year or so after all this sort of thing kind of dies down as far as the COVID-19 virus?
Well, I'm going to be speaking I always speak at Roswell over the 4th of July for their Roswell Festival. I always speak in Exeter, New Hampshire over Labor Day. I'm going to be speaking I think it's the last weekend in September of 2021 at a conference in Michigan. So I do have conferences that have been postponed from this year
Sure.
to next year that I'll be doing. I'll be at the MUFON Symposium next year as well. I'm writing a new book.
Yep.
And that will probably not be published until 2022 or 23. But for next year, it's going to be the 60th anniversary of the Hills abduction.
Unbelievable.
And with that, I am putting out a new edition of Captured. I have been working over many years to gather more evidence, and scientific evidence has been evaluated by scientists. It's secret now, but I'm going to reveal all of that in the updated book that will be released in 2021.
Sweet.
So I'm really excited about that. And also, Bryce Zabel, who has an option on Captured, is a Hollywood producer from Stellar Productions. And he has just partnered with another producer to do they are developing a television series on Betty and Barney as an interracial couple married in the early 60s who were civil rights advocates and who had this crazy UFO thing happen to them that just kept coming back into their lives and interfering with what their true goals were.
How incredible is that? I mean, the truth is, and we'll end it with this, that your aunt and uncle, Betty and Barney Hill, had a number of things referenced. I think there was an X-Files episode that was sort of similar. I think wasn't there a movie with James Earl Jones? I think that's the first time I actually heard about Betty and Barney Hill. It was in the 70s, or maybe it was a made-for-TV movie or something like that.
Yes, the UFO incident in 1975. Bryce Zabel had a series, Dark Skies.
Dark Skies, right,
that.
yeah.
Project Blue Book that was just on the History Channel.
Yep.
The past year, it had an episode. It wasn't accurate, but it was on the hills.
So hopefully this one will be interesting and maybe be a little bit more accurate. How wonderful is that, though, that their legacy will live on, and we're still talking about it now. And again, in 60 years later, this is still a pertinent subject. And you and I are here sharing a little bit of airwaves talking about it, and it has been a pleasure to have you on, Kathleen. Thank you so much for taking as much time as you have.
Well, thank you. It was a pleasure for me as well, and I'll look forward to our next conversation.
Outstanding. I will be in touch with you shortly. And hey, everybody, go to the website, Kathleen-Marden.com, for more information about everything that you've heard here on the Edge of the Unknown. Kathleen, again, thanks so much. Have a great night and stick around, and we will say our final goodbyes off the air. Hey, everybody. Thanks for listening to The Edge of the Unknown and Uncle Josh's True Scary Stories. It's a pleasure to bring you both of these podcasts and YouTube videos. Thanks to Mark 9 for providing all the music for The Edge of the Unknown, and thanks to the sponsors as well. Much more coming up in the weeks to come. Everybody, stick around, and in the meantime, be excellent to each other, wash your hands, stay safe. We'll see you here next time on The Edge of the Unknown.